The rain fell like broken promises against the pavement, each drop shattering into tiny fragments of regret. I pulled my threadbare coat tighter around my shoulders, cursing the late shift at Rosie's diner and the bus that never came. 3 miles of walking in this downpour had left my uniform soaked through, my cheap sneakers squelching with every step. The streetlights cast hazy yellow halos through the storm, barely illuminating the deserted streets of this part of town, a place where people like me struggled to make ends meet, while the high-rises downtown glittered with wealth and privilege we'd never know. I was so focused on avoiding puddles that I almost missed the small figure huddled beneath the awning of the shuttered convenience store. A child, a boy no older than 5 or 6, stood shivering, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, tears mingling with raindrops on his cheeks. "Hey," I called softly, approaching slowly so as not to frighten him. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" He looked up at me with enormous dark eyes, his lower lip trembling. "I don't know. I got lost." His voice was barely audible above the drumming of the rain, but I caught the slight accent, something European perhaps. "I'm Emma," I said, crouching down to his level, despite the water seeping through the knees of my uniform. "What's your name?" "Matteo," he whispered, his small shoulders hunched against the cold. "Matteo, that's a nice name. How long have you been out here?" I glanced around, looking for any sign of panicked parents searching for their missing child. "I don't know." His chin quivered. "We were at the restaurant and I wanted to see the fountain, but then people were everywhere and I couldn't find Papa." I checked my watch. Nearly midnight. What restaurant would have a child this young out so late? But who was I to judge? My own childhood hadn't exactly been conventional. "You must be freezing. Let's get you somewhere warm, and we can call the police to help find your father." I offered my hand, expecting hesitation, but he grabbed it immediately, his small fingers ice-cold against my palm. "Papa says never talk to police," he stated with such conviction that I blinked in surprise. "Oh, well, we need to find your dad somehow." I glanced up and down the empty street. My apartment was just 2 blocks away. "How about we go to my place? You can dry off, and we'll figure out how to contact your family." It wasn't until we were walking that I noticed his clothes. Designer jeans, and what appeared to be a cashmere sweater beneath his expensive-looking coat. This kid wasn't from my neighborhood, not even close. My apartment was a 3rd-floor walk-up in a building that had seen better days. The hallway smelled perpetually of cabbage and cigarettes, but at least it was warm and dry. Matteo followed me silently up the stairs, his eyes taking in the peeling wallpaper and flickering overhead light. "It's not much," I said apologetically as I unlocked my door, suddenly self-conscious about the threadbare furniture and water stains on the ceiling. "But it's home." Matteo nodded solemnly. "Thank you for helping me." I found him a clean towel, my nicest one without frayed edges, and a t-shirt that hung like a dress on his small frame. While he changed in the bathroom, I made hot chocolate, dumping extra marshmallows in his mug. My mind raced through options. He didn't want police, but I needed to report finding a lost child. Yet something in his demeanor made me hesitate. There was a wariness in those dark eyes that reminded me of myself at his age, after my mom died and I bounced between foster homes, learning quickly which adults could be trusted. "Can I use your phone to call my uncle?" Matteo asked when he emerged, his wet clothes bundled in his arms. "Of course. Do you know his number?" I placed the steaming mug of cocoa before him at my kitchen table. Matteo recited a number from memory, and I dialed it on my ancient landline phone. Cell service in my building was practically non-existent. The line rang once, twice, then a deep male voice answered, speaking rapid Italian. Hello," I interrupted. "I don't speak Italian, but I found a boy named Matteo. He's safe with me, and he asked to call this number." There was a pause. Then the voice switched to English, heavily accented but perfectly fluent. "You found Matteo? Where? Is he hurt?" The concern was evident, but there was something else in that voice. A hardness beneath the worry that made the hair on my arms stand up. "He's fine, just wet from the rain. I found him near Lexington and 42nd. He said he got separated from his father at a restaurant. Give him the phone, please." The command was polite, but left no room for argument. I I handed the receiver to Matteo, who began speaking rapid Italian, occasionally glancing at me. After a minute, he handed the phone back. My uncle says thank you for helping me. Someone will come to get me soon. I took the phone. Hello? Who will be coming? Should I bring him somewhere instead? A car is already on the way to you. The voice was curt, efficient. What is your address? I hesitated, suddenly aware of how foolish it was to bring a strange child to my home. What if this was some kind of setup? But looking at Matteo's innocent face as he sipped his hot chocolate, marshmallow foam on his upper lip, I pushed the paranoia aside. I gave him my address, and he responded, 20 minutes. Thank you for your kindness, Miss Emma Walsh. Miss Walsh, the family won't forget this. The call ended abruptly. I put the phone down, unsettled by the exchange. Your uncle sounds intense. Matteo nodded matter-of-factly. Uncle Sal gets worried. Papa says he's too serious. And where is your papa now? Matteo's face clouded. He was talking to some men at the restaurant. He told me to sit still, but the fountain had fish in it. He looked down, ashamed. Papa will be angry I didn't listen. I sat across from him. I'm sure he's just worried about you. Parents get scared when they can't find their children. Papa doesn't get scared, Matteo said with absolute certainty. He makes other people scared. Before I could process that statement, headlights swept across my living room window. I peered down to the street to see a black SUV with tinted windows double-parked outside my building. Two broad-shouldered men in dark suits emerged, scanning the street with practiced efficiency, before one spoke into his wrist. I think your ride is here, I said, my mouth suddenly dry. Matteo nodded, draining the last of his hot chocolate. Can I keep wearing this? He plucked at the oversized t-shirt. My clothes are still wet. Of course. Let me put your things in a bag. I quickly gathered his damp clothes, stuffing them into a plastic grocery bag. My mind was racing. What kind of family sent men who looked like Secret Service agents to pick up a child? A sharp knock at my door made me jump. Matteo didn't seem concerned at all. Who is it? I called, suddenly wishing my door had a peephole. Miss Walsh? We're here for Matteo. The voice was professional, impersonal. I opened the door cautiously, chains still in place. Two men stood in my hallway, both wearing identical black suits despite the late hour and the rain. The taller one had a scar running from his temple to his jaw. The other wore sunglasses despite being indoors at midnight. ID? I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. Scarface smiled slightly, reaching into his jacket. I tensed, but he simply produced a leather wallet, flipping it open to show some kind of security credential. The name Salvatore Ricci Security was embossed in gold. Matteo, do you know these men? I called over my shoulder, not taking my eyes off them. That's Marco and Enzo, he confirmed, appearing beside me. They work for Papa. I reluctantly unchained the door. Marco, the one with the scar, stepped inside while Enzo remained in the hallway, hand discreetly inside his jacket. Thank you for looking after him, Marco said, his tone softening as he crouched to Matteo's level. Your father has been very worried. Is he mad? Matteo asked, his voice small. No, Piccolo, not at you. Marco looked up at me. Mr. Ricci would like to thank you personally for helping his son. My breath caught. Mr. Ricci is coming here? Marco shook his head. He would like you to accompany us, if you're willing. He's currently at the hospital with Matteo's grandmother. Hospital? I echoed. Nothing serious, Marco assured quickly. A precautionary visit, Mr. Ricci insists on expressing his gratitude. It would be unwise to refuse. Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. This wasn't really a request. I have work in the morning, I hedged. Mr. Ricci will compensate you for any inconvenience, Marco said smoothly, and ensure you arrive at work on time. I glanced at Matteo, who was watching me with those solemn dark eyes. Please come, he said quietly. Papa will want to meet you. Against every rational instinct, I found myself nodding. Let me get my coat. As I gathered my things, I tried to suppress the voice in my head screaming that this was a terrible idea. But something about Matteo's expression, a mixture of hope and something that looked oddly like concern, made me push my fear aside. What I didn't know then, as I locked my apartment door and followed 2 obvious bodyguards to a luxury SUV, was that I'd just made a choice that would irrevocably change the course of my life. That by showing kindness to a lost child in the rain, I had inadvertently stepped into the orbit of Antonio Ricci, the most feared mafia boss on the East Coast, a man whose empire was built on blood and secrets, and whose attention was the last thing someone like me should want, but it was too late. The car door closed behind me with the finality of a prison cell, and we pulled away from the curb, heading toward a destiny I couldn't yet imagine. The SUV glided through the rain-slicked streets like a phantom, its engine barely audible. Inside, the leather seats were butter-soft beneath my fingertips, the air perfumed with something expensive I couldn't name. Matteo sat beside me, his small hand occasionally brushing against mine, as if to reassure himself I was still there. The 2 men, Marco and Enzo, rode in silence, Marco driving while Enzo occasionally spoke in hushed Italian into a phone. "Is the hospital far?" I asked, trying to break the suffocating silence. "Mount Sinai," Marco replied without turning. 20 minutes in this traffic." I glanced out the window, watching as we left my neighborhood behind, the buildings growing more polished, the streets wider and cleaner. We were heading into a world I only glimpsed when serving coffee to the suited businessmen who occasionally slummed it at Rosie's. "My papa has a big room at the hospital," Matteo volunteered, looking up at me. "With guards and special doctors for Nonna." "Your grandmother must be very important," I said carefully. Matteo nodded solemnly. "Papa says family is everything." The way he said it, like reciting scripture, made me wonder what kind of man I was about to meet. What kind of man employed security guards who looked like they killed people for breakfast and had special hospital rooms with private doctors. The car pulled into a private entrance at the hospital, bypassing the emergency room entirely. A security guard waved us through without question, and we were escorted through service corridors and a private elevator. The entire floor seemed eerily quiet. No bustling nurses, no beeping machines in the hallway, just more men in suits standing at strategic points. "Wait here," Marco instructed as we reached a sleek waiting area that looked more like a luxury hotel lobby than a hospital space. He disappeared through double doors, leaving Enzo standing guard over us like we might make a break for it. "Are you scared?" Matteo whispered, leaning closer to me. I forced a smile. "Should I be?" He shook his head. "Papa is scary to bad people. You're not bad." Before I could respond, the double doors opened again. Marco emerged, nodding to me. "Mr. Ricci will see you now." My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood, smoothing my still damp waitress uniform self-consciously. Matteo slipped his small hand into mine. "It's okay," he said, leading me forward with surprising confidence. "I'll protect you." The room beyond was spacious and dimly lit. Medical equipment had been discreetly arranged around a hospital bed, where an elderly woman lay sleeping, her silver hair fanned across the pillow. Beside her sat a man in a chair, his back to us, his hand holding the woman's frail one. At our entrance, he stood and turned, and I felt the air leave my lungs. Antonio Ricci was not what I expected. In my mind, I'd pictured someone older, heavier, perhaps with a pinstripe suit and gold rings. The man before me was tall and lean, perhaps in his late 30s, with sharp cheekbones and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the light. His suit was immaculately tailored, midnight blue rather than black, with no tie, the top buttons of his crisp shirt undone to reveal the edge of what might have been a tattoo at his collarbone. But it was the way he moved that truly unsettled me, with the silent, predatory grace of someone who owned not just the room, but everything and everyone in it. His eyes, Matteo's eyes, assessed me in a single sweeping glance that made me feel as though I'd been stripped bare. "Papa!" Matteo broke away from me, running to his father. The transformation in Antonio's face was immediate and startling. The hardness melted away as he crouched to embrace his son, his large hands checking Matteo for injuries with gentle precision. "Matteo mio," he murmured, voice rich and accented. "You frightened me." "I'm sorry, Papa," Matteo replied, his face buried in his father's shoulder. "I got lost." "We will discuss your disobedience later," Antonio said. But there was no anger in his tone, only relief. He looked up at me over his son's head, and the intensity of his gaze made me take an involuntary step backward. And this must be Miss Walsh. He stood, keeping one hand protectively on Matteo's shoulder. My son tells me you rescued him from the rain and gave him shelter. The Ricci family owes you a debt of gratitude. Anyone would have done the same, I said, my voice smaller than I intended. A smile played at the corners of his mouth, though it didn't reach his eyes. I think we both know that isn't true, especially in this city. He gestured to a seating area in the corner of the room. Please sit. We have much to discuss. It wasn't a request. I perched on the edge of a leather armchair, acutely aware of my damp hair and rumpled uniform. Antonio whispered something to Matteo, who nodded and went to sit by his grandmother's bedside, pulling a small handheld game from the bedside table. Your grandmother? I asked as Antonio took the seat across from me. My mother, he corrected. A minor stroke. She will recover fully, but I prefer to have her under constant observation. He studied me with unnerving focus. Matteo tells me you refused to call the police when you found him. He seemed frightened by the idea, I explained, wondering if this was some kind of test, and I've had mixed experiences with police myself. Foster system, I added, unsure why I was volunteering personal information to this intimidating stranger. Antonio nodded slowly, a woman of instinct. Good. He leaned forward slightly. You must understand, Miss Walsh. My family's privacy is of paramount importance. Matteo's safety even more so, of course. My son says you live alone, work at a diner, and gave him your favorite t-shirt. His gaze flicked briefly to the window where rain still lashed against the glass. Tell me, what does a woman like you want from life, Emma Walsh? The sudden personal question caught me off guard. Excuse me? It's a simple question. You're what, 25? Living in a neighborhood where gunshots are as common as car alarms, working for minimum wage plus tips. What is your endgame? I bristled despite my fear. I'm surviving, Mr. Ricci. Not everyone has the luxury of endgames or 5-year plans. To my surprise, he smiled, a genuine one this time that transformed his severe features. Honesty. Refreshing. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. Name your price. My... what? For helping my son. He uncapped an expensive-looking fountain pen. 10,000? 20? I can be generous when the situation warrants. I stared at him, heat rising to my face. I don't want your money. Antonio paused, pen hovering over the checkbook. Everyone wants money, Miss Walsh. I wanted to help a scared child, I countered. I'm not looking for a reward. He studied me for a long moment, then slowly returned the checkbook to his jacket. Then what do you want? To go home, I said honestly. I have an early shift tomorrow. Antonio checked his watch, a timepiece that probably cost more than I made in a year. At this diner. Rosie's, Matteo mentioned. I nodded, suddenly uneasy that he knew where I worked. The one on 36th and 8th? He didn't wait for confirmation. 6 a.m. shift? How did you... I make it my business to know things, Miss Walsh. He stood abruptly. You will be driven home immediately. I apologize for the inconvenience of bringing you here. I rose uncertainly. It's fine. I wanted to make sure Matteo was okay. Antonio's gaze softened fractionally as it moved to his son, who was now dozing in the chair beside his grandmother. He is resilient, like his mother was. There was a story there, but not one I had any right to ask about. I should go. Of course. He snapped his fingers, and Marco materialized as if he'd been waiting just outside the door. See Miss Walsh safely home. I nodded a goodbye and turned to leave, but Antonio's voice stopped me. Emma. The sound of my name in his accented voice sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. I looked back at him. Thank you, he said simply, the words clearly unfamiliar on his tongue. Truly. Something in his expression, a flash of genuine emotion breaking through that controlled exterior, made my breath catch. For a moment, he wasn't the intimidating figure who commanded rooms and men, but just a father grateful that his son had been kept safe. You're welcome, I replied softly. He's a special kid. The corner of Antonio's mouth lifted. Yes, he is. He hesitated, then added, Perhaps our paths will cross again, Emma Walsh. It sounded like both a promise and a warning. The ride back to my apartment passed in a blur. Marco remained silent, and I was too exhausted and overwhelmed to attempt conversation. When we finally pulled up outside my building, he spoke for the first time since leaving the hospital. Mr. Ricci doesn't forget favors, he said, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. Or the people who provide them. Before I could respond, he exited the car and opened my door with formal courtesy. Good night, Miss Walsh. I climbed the stairs to my apartment in a daze, barely registering the familiar smells and sounds of the building. Inside, I locked my door and leaned against it, finally allowing myself to tremble. The encounter felt dreamlike now. The luxury SUV, the private hospital floor, the intense man with Matteo's eyes who had offered me more money than I'd ever seen for doing what any decent person would do. On my kitchen table sat Matteo's mug, the remnants of hot chocolate dried at the bottom. Evidence that it hadn't been a dream after all. I should have known it would end there. A strange night. A story to tell someday. But as I finally crawled into bed, exhaustion claiming me, I couldn't shake the feeling that Antonio Ricci's words had been prophetic, that our paths would indeed cross again. I didn't know then how right I was, or how completely my life would unravel in the coming days. Morning came too soon, my alarm shrieking at 4:30 a.m. I dragged myself to the shower, mind still foggy from too little sleep, and strange dreams involving dark eyes and rain-soaked streets. The hot water helped, though my uniform from last night was still damp. I pulled on my spare, slightly faded from too many washes, and gathered my hair into a ponytail. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that reflected the lightening sky and the crisp scent of washed concrete. I hurried toward the bus stop, already calculating how many tables I'd need to turn to make this month's rent, after spending money on hot chocolate I couldn't really afford. I was so lost in thought that I almost missed it. A gleaming black car parked across from the bus stop, its engine running quietly. As I approached, the back window slid down, revealing Antonio Ricci's unreadable face. "Good morning, Miss Walsh," he said, as though encountering me on the street at 5:15 a.m. was the most natural thing in the world. "I believe you have a shift to get to." My feet froze to the pavement. "Mr. Ricci?" I managed, wondering if lack of sleep was making me hallucinate. "What are you doing here?" "Offering you a ride," he replied smoothly. "It's the least I can do." I glanced toward the bus stop, where several people huddled, looking miserable in the damp morning chill. My bus was notoriously unreliable, often making me sprint the last few blocks to avoid Rosie's wrath. "I don't think," I began. But Antonio opened the car door. "Please," he said, the word sounding unfamiliar on his tongue. "Matteo would be disappointed to learn I didn't ensure you arrived safely at work after your late night helping him." The mention of Matteo weakened my resolve. I thought of his solemn eyes, the way his small hand had felt in mine. With a sigh of surrender, I slid into the back seat beside Antonio, the door closing behind me with that same ominous finality I'd felt last night. Inside, the car smelled of expensive leather and Antonio's cologne, something woodsy and subtle that reminded me of forests I'd never visited. He sat with casual elegance, one arm stretched along the back of the seat, not quite touching me, but close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. "How is Matteo?" I asked, desperate to break the silence. "Sleeping. Last night tired him." Antonio's gaze remained on my face, making it difficult to breathe normally. "Your uniform is different today," I flushed, smoothing the faded fabric self-consciously. "My other one got wet in the rain." He made a non-committal sound, then spoke to the driver in rapid Italian. The car pulled smoothly into traffic. "I'm curious about something, Miss Walsh," Antonio said after a moment. "A woman with your resourcefulness could surely find better employment than serving greasy eggs to commuters." The casual dismissal of my livelihood stung. "Waitressing is honest work," I replied, more defensively than I intended. "And jobs aren't exactly falling from trees for college dropouts with no family connections." "Ah," he nodded slowly. "And what did you study before dropping out?" I hesitated. These weren't normal getting-to-know-you questions. They felt like an interrogation, albeit a velvet-gloved one. "Nursing, for a year and a half. Why do you care?" A hint of a smile touched his lips. I find you interesting. A young woman alone in the city, struggling to survive, yet when offered money, substantial money, she refuses. I told you, I didn't help Mateo for a reward. Yes, you mentioned that. His dark eyes studied me with unnerving intensity. Which brings me to my proposition. My stomach tightened. Proposition? My mother's private nurse has recently departed for a position in California. The timing is inconvenient, given her condition. He adjusted his cuff, revealing a glimpse of a platinum watch. I find myself in need of someone trustworthy to assist with her care as she recovers. I blinked in surprise. You're offering me a job? As a nurse? But I never finished my degree. You have more training than most, and my mother's medical needs are supervised by doctors. She primarily needs assistance with daily tasks, medications, and companionship. His voice softened slightly. She took a liking to you last night, though you may not have noticed. She was awake briefly while you spoke with Mateo. The car slowed, and I realized we'd arrived at Rosie's. The diner's neon sign buzzed in the early morning gloom, the windows still dark. We were 10 minutes early. I have a job, I said, though even to my ears it sounded weak. Antonio raised an eyebrow, one that barely covers your rent in an apartment with questionable wiring and a persistent cockroach problem. I stiffened. Have you been investigating me? I investigate everyone who comes into contact with my family, he replied unapologetically. Particularly those who spend time alone with my son. I reached for the door handle, suddenly claustrophobic. Thanks for the ride, Mr. Ricci, but I need to get to work. His hand caught my wrist, his grip firm but not painful. The contact sent an electric shock up my arm. The position pays $15,000 a month, with accommodations in my mother's wing of our home, full benefits, and guaranteed hours for continuing education should you wish to complete your nursing degree. The number hit me like a physical blow. $15,000 a month was more than I made in half a year at Rosie's. It was rent without roommates, debt paid off, maybe even savings. It was a life I couldn't even imagine. Why me? I whispered. You could hire anyone with that salary. Someone with actual credentials. Antonio released my wrist, his fingers trailing briefly across my pulse point. As I said, my mother likes you. Mateo trusts you. These are rare occurrences. He paused, and something in his expression shifted. And I repay my debts, Emma, always. The way he said my name made my skin prickle with awareness. This wasn't just about gratitude or his mother's care. There was something else at play. Something I couldn't quite grasp. I need time to think, I managed. He nodded, reaching into his jacket to produce a business card. Thick, creamy stock, with just a phone number embossed in gold. Call this number when you've decided. The offer stands until Friday. He glanced at Rosie's. Now, I believe you have tables to serve. I took the card, my fingers brushing against his. Thank you for the ride. For a moment, I thought I saw something like amusement flicker in his eyes. Until we meet again, Emma Walsh. The workday passed in a haze. I spilled coffee twice, mixed up orders, and nearly set fire to a stack of napkins when I left them too close to the grill. My mind kept circling back to Antonio's offer, to the impossible sum of money, to the way his eyes had held mine as he'd spoken. Earth to Emma! Rosie snapped, her weathered face creased with annoyance. Table 6 has been waiting 10 minutes for their check. What's wrong with you today? Sorry, I mumbled, hurrying to the register. Didn't sleep well. Yeah, well, none of us did, she grumbled. That storm kept half the neighborhood up. Doesn't mean we can sleepwalk through the morning rush. I nodded contritely and delivered the check to table 6, a pair of businessmen who barely glanced up from their phones as I approached. One left a $1 tip on a $30 breakfast. Typical. By the time my shift ended at 2, my feet were throbbing and my mind was made up. Antonio's offer was tempting, ridiculously so, but I'd learned the hard way that things that seemed too good to be true usually were. Whatever game he was playing, I wanted no part of it. I stepped out of Rosie's into the afternoon sunlight, untying my apron and stuffing it into my bag. The same black car from this morning idled across the street. My heart stuttered. The window rolled down, but it wasn't Antonio inside. It was Marco, his scarred face impassive. Miss Walsh, he called. Mr. Ricci requests your presence. I haven't decided about the job yet, I replied, remaining on the sidewalk. This isn't about the job, Marco said. It's about Matteo. He's asking for you. My resistance crumbled at the mention of the boy. Is he okay? He's fine, but insistent. Children's whims. Marco shrugged. Mr. Ricci thought perhaps you might join them for a late lunch. I hesitated, torn between suspicion and curiosity. And if I say no? Marco's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. Mr. Ricci isn't accustomed to hearing that word, Miss Walsh. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't a threat. Not exactly. But the implication was clear. I thought about making a scene, about walking away, about calling out to the people passing by. But what would I say? Help, a mafia boss wants to buy me lunch? Because that's what he was. I'd spent my break researching Antonio Ricci on my ancient smartphone, finding only vague references to a business empire spanning real estate, imports, and private security. The articles danced around his reputation, never stating outright what everyone seemed to know, that the Ricci name was whispered with fear in certain circles, that private security meant something far more sinister. And yet, he was also Matteo's father, a man who had held his mother's hand at her hospital bedside and spoken of family like it was sacred. Fine, I said finally. Just lunch. The restaurant was in Midtown, discreet and elegant, the kind of place with no prices on the menu, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. Antonio and Matteo waited at a corner table, partially screened by a lush arrangement of flowers. Matteo's face lit up when he saw me. Emma, he exclaimed, jumping up from his chair. You came! I couldn't help smiling at his enthusiasm. Hi, buddy. How are you feeling today? Good. Papa let me sleep late and have gelato for breakfast. He glanced guiltily at his father. I wasn't supposed to tell about the gelato. Antonio's mouth quirked. Some secrets are harder to keep than others. He stood as I approached, that old-world courtesy at odds with the danger that seemed to radiate from him. Thank you for joining us, Emma. Please sit. The meal passed in a surreal blur. Matteo chatted happily about his grandmother's improved condition, his school in Italy where they'd soon return, and a dozen other topics that bounced from his active mind. Antonio watched him with quiet pride, occasionally steering the conversation when Matteo veered too close to subjects that made his father's expression tighten imperceptibly. Throughout it all, I felt Antonio's gaze returning to me, assessing, calculating. Whenever our eyes met, I felt that same electric awareness I'd experienced in the car. It was unsettling how much I didn't hate it. As dessert arrived, a delicate confection that probably cost more than I made in an hour, Antonio's phone buzzed. He checked it, his expression darkening. Excuse me, he said, standing. A matter requires my attention. Matteo, entertain Miss Walsh for a moment. He stepped away from the table, moving toward the restaurant entrance where Marco waited. They spoke in hushed tones, Antonio's posture rigid with what looked like anger. Papa's business is always calling. Matteo sighed, poking at his dessert. Even in Italy. Do you miss Italy? I asked, trying to distract him from his father's tense conversation. He nodded. Our house there has horses and a pool, and the ocean is so blue. His expression grew wistful. But Papa says we have to stay in America for now, because of business. Antonio returned before I could probe further, his face composed once more into unreadable lines. Matteo, it's time to go. Your grandmother is asking for you. Matteo sighed dramatically, but stood obediently. Antonio turned to me. I apologize for cutting this short. My car will take you wherever you wish to go. That's not necessary, I began, but he waved away my protest. I insist. His eyes held mine. Have you considered my offer? The question caught me off guard. I'm still thinking about it. He nodded, unsurprised. Of course. But don't think too long, Emma. Opportunities like this are rare. As we exited the restaurant, I noticed more security had materialized. 3 men in suits forming a loose perimeter around us. Antonio kept Matteo close, one hand always on his son's shoulder. Outside, 2 black SUVs waited. Will I see you again? Matteo asked me, his dark eyes, so like his father's, wide with hope. I crouched to his level. Maybe. That depends on a lot of things. If you come work for Nona, we could see you every day, he said, as though it were that simple. I glanced up at Antonio, who watched our interaction with an intensity that made my chest tight. We'll see, buddy. As I straightened, Antonio leaned closer, his breath warm against my ear. The world I can offer you is very different from the one you know, Emma. Better in most ways, more dangerous in others, but I think you might belong in it more than you realize. Before I could respond, he ushered Matteo into the first SUV and nodded to Marco, who opened the door of the second one for me. I climbed in, my mind spinning with Antonio's words and the implications behind them. What I didn't know then was that Antonio Ricci never made offers without calculating all possible outcomes, that every move in his world was strategic, deliberate, and that the decision I was agonizing over had, in his mind, already been made. 2 days passed in a fog of indecision. I went through the motions at Rosie's, pouring coffee and taking orders while my mind replayed every interaction with Antonio and Matteo. The business card he'd given me burned a hole in my pocket, the embossed numbers seeming to pulse with possibility each time my fingers brushed against it. On the third morning, I arrived at work to find Rosie in an unusual state of agitation, pacing behind the counter with her phone pressed to her ear. "What do you mean you can't tell me who?" she barked. "It's my damn diner." She noticed me hovering by the staff entrance and waved me over frantically. "Emma, do you know anything about this?" "About what?" I asked, tying my apron with practiced movements. "Some hotshot lawyer called this morning. Says the diner's been bought out. New ownership effective immediately." Her weathered face was flushed with anger. 20 years I've run this place, and now some faceless corporation swoops in and buys the building right out from under me. My blood ran cold. Did they say who bought it? Some investment firm. Ricci Holdings or something. She narrowed her eyes at my expression. "Why? You know something about this?" I shook my head quickly, perhaps too quickly. "No, of course not. I'm just surprised." Rosie wasn't convinced. "Well, the new owner's representative is coming in today to discuss the transition, whatever that means." She shoved a coffee pot into my hands. "Meanwhile, we've still got customers to serve." The morning rush came and went, but I couldn't shake the feeling of impending doom. It couldn't be a coincidence. Ricci Holdings. The timing was too perfect, the message too clear. Antonio Ricci could buy and sell my world on a whim. At precisely 11 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. I looked up from wiping down a table to see a woman in a tailored suit entering the diner. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on me with unsettling precision. "Ms. Walsh?" She approached, extending a manicured hand. "Diane Winters, representing Ricci Holdings. I believe you're acquainted with Mr. Ricci." "We've met," I said carefully, aware of Rosie watching from behind the counter. "Mr. Ricci would like to speak with you." She gestured toward the door where, sure enough, the now familiar black SUV idled at the curb. "If you'll come with me?" I glanced at Rosie, who had abandoned any pretense of not eavesdropping. "I'm working." "Your shift has been covered," Diane replied smoothly. "Mr. Ricci has arranged for a temporary replacement until the staffing transition is complete." As if on cue, the door opened again, and a young man in a pressed uniform that matched mine entered, nodding respectfully to Diane. "This is bullshit," Rosie sputtered, storming over. "You can't just waltz in here and—" Diane turned to her with practiced calm. "Ms. Rosario, I believe you'll find the terms of the buyout quite generous. The paperwork is ready for your review. If you'll step into your office." I watched in stunned disbelief as Rosie, fierce, uncompromising Rosie, who once chased a would-be robber out with nothing but a spatula, allowed herself to be led toward the back office, her resistance melting at whatever figure Diane had quietly mentioned. "Ms. Walsh?" Diane prompted, gesturing again to the door. In a daze, I untied my apron and followed her outside. Marco held the SUV door open, his face impassive as ever. Antonio sat inside, immaculate in a charcoal suit, his attention focused on documents spread across a small fold-down table. He looked up as I entered, his dark eyes unreadable. "Emma," he greeted me, as though orchestrating a hostile takeover of my workplace was a perfectly normal way to arrange a meeting. Thank you for joining me. The door closed behind me, and the vehicle pulled smoothly into traffic. I clenched my fists in my lap, anger finally breaking through my shock. What do you think you're doing? I demanded. Buying rosies? Sending in your people? What is this? Some kind of power play? Antonio gathered his documents unhurriedly, sliding them into a leather portfolio. A business opportunity. The building has been undervalued for years. The previous owner was eager to sell. The previous owner was Rosie's landlord, and now she has no say in her own business. My voice rose despite my efforts to control it. People's livelihoods are at stake. No jobs will be lost in the transition, Antonio replied calmly. In fact, wages will increase, and the establishment will undergo much-needed renovations. Ms. Rosario will be offered a generous management contract, should she wish to stay on. His reasonableness only fueled my anger. That's not the point. You can't just rearrange people's lives to get what you want. Antonio's expression shifted subtly, a hardness entering his eyes. Can I? The simple question, delivered in that soft, accented voice, sent a chill down my spine. Of course he could. He was Antonio Ricci. He probably bought and sold businesses before breakfast, moved pieces on the chessboard of his world without concern for the pawns involved. Why? I asked, my voice smaller now. Why Rosie's? Why me? He studied me for a long moment. I told you once that I repay my debts. You helped Mateo when you had no obligation to do so. Now I'm helping you. By taking over my workplace, I shook my head in disbelief. That's not help. That's control. A fine line, he conceded, but one I've never had difficulty crossing when necessary. He leaned forward slightly. The offer I made still stands, Emma. My mother asks for you daily. Mateo speaks of little else, and if I say no, I challenged, though my voice wavered. Something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Then you say no. You continue serving mediocre coffee for minimum wage, living in an apartment with faulty wiring, struggling to make rent. Your choice. The SUV slowed to a stop, and I realized we'd arrived at my building. Antonio must have signaled to Marco somehow, because the door beside me opened, sunlight streaming into the dim interior. You have until tomorrow, Antonio said, his voice softening slightly. I'm not a patient man, Emma, but for you, I'm making an exception. I stepped out onto the sidewalk on shaky legs. What happens to Rosie's if I say yes? Antonio's mouth curved in the ghost of a smile. It becomes a better version of itself. As for Ms. Rosario, she'll find her golden years much more comfortable than she anticipated. The door closed before I could respond, the SUV pulling away and leaving me standing alone, more confused and conflicted than ever. Upstairs, my apartment felt smaller and shabbier than usual, the water stains on the ceiling more pronounced, the hum of the ancient refrigerator more grating. I paced the cramped space, Antonio's words echoing in my head. The world I can offer you is very different from the one you know. Was I really considering this, stepping into the orbit of a man who bought businesses on a whim, who commanded an army of suits and cars, who spoke of debts and obligations like they were sacred texts, a man who, if my internet searches were anything to go by, operated in shadows so deep the law couldn't penetrate them? My phone rang, startling me. Unknown caller. I answered warily. Emma? A small voice came through the line. It's Mateo. My tension eased slightly. Hey, buddy. How did you get my number? Papa has everyone's number, he replied matter-of-factly. Nona is asking for you. She says the other nurses are too rough when they help her walk. I sank onto my sagging couch. Mateo, I don't know if I can... Please? He interrupted, his voice small. Papa is always busy with work, and I get lonely. If you came to live with us, we could watch movies, and you could read me stories like you did that night. My heart twisted. It's not that simple, Mateo. Why not? Don't you like us? The hurt in his voice was palpable. Of course I like you, I assured him quickly. It's just complicated adult stuff. Papa says that too. Mateo sighed with the exasperation of a child used to being excluded from important conversations. He says I'll understand when I'm older. Your father is right about that, I said, smiling despite myself. There was a muffled conversation on the other end. Then Mateo's voice returned. "I have to go. Papa says it's time for my piano lesson." He hesitated. "Will you at least think about it, please?" "I'll think about it," I promised, knowing I'd done little else for days. "Okay. Bye, Emma." The line went dead. I stared at my phone, conflicted emotions churning inside me. The apartment felt emptier somehow, the silence more oppressive after Mateo's voice. My gaze fell on the business card Antonio had given me, still sitting on my coffee table. Before I could overthink it, I dialed the number. It rang once before a professional female voice answered. "Mr. Ricci's office. This is Emma Walsh," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Ricci." "One moment, Ms. Walsh." There was no hold music, just silence. Then, "Mr. Ricci will see you tonight. A car will arrive at 7. See me? I just wanted to talk." 7 o'clock, Ms. Walsh. Formal attire is requested." The line disconnected. Formal attire? I looked down at my limited wardrobe. Jeans, t-shirts, and work uniforms hanging in my cramped closet. The nicest thing I owned was a simple black dress I'd worn to a former foster mother's funeral 3 years ago. 7 o'clock found me standing nervously on the curb, wearing the black dress that was a touch too tight now, my hair swept up in what I hoped was an elegant twist. The dress was plain, but I'd splurged on red lipstick from the drugstore, a flash of defiance against whatever game Antonio was playing. The car that arrived wasn't the usual SUV, but a sleek silver Bentley, Marco emerging to open the door with a respectful nod. "Where are we going?" I asked as we pulled away from my building. "Mr. Ricci is hosting a charity event at the Metropolitan," Marco replied. "He requested your presence." My stomach dropped. The Metropolitan was one of the most exclusive venues in the city, a place I'd only glimpsed from the outside. "I'm not dressed for a charity event." Marco's eyes met mine briefly in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Ricci has arranged everything." "What does that mean?" I demanded. But Marco had returned to his usual stoic silence. We pulled up to a side entrance of the Metropolitan, where a woman waited with a garment bag draped over her arm. She introduced herself as Antonio's personal stylist and whisked me into a private room that looked like a luxury boutique, complete with champagne and an array of dresses that made me gasp. "Mr. Ricci suggested this one," she said, unzipping the bag to reveal a midnight blue gown that shimmered under the lights. "But he said the final choice was yours." I stared at the dress, then at the collection surrounding me. "This is insane. I can't accept." "Mr. Ricci was quite clear," she interrupted smoothly. "He said to tell you this isn't a gift. It's a uniform. For tonight's role." "And what role is that exactly?" I asked, fingering the delicate fabric of the blue dress despite myself. She smiled enigmatically. "That's between you and Mr. Ricci." An hour later, I hardly recognized the woman in the mirror. The blue dress fit as though it had been made for me, hugging my curves before flowing gracefully to the floor. My hair had been styled into elegant waves, my makeup subtle but enhancing. Diamond earrings, on loan, the stylist had insisted, caught the light when I moved. Marco escorted me through the service corridors of the Metropolitan, finally emerging into a grand ballroom filled with New York's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the crowd, the soft music of a string quartet floating above the hum of conversation. I spotted Antonio immediately. He stood near the center of the room, commanding attention in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, surrounded by a circle of rapt listeners. As though sensing my presence, he looked up, his gaze locking with mine across the room. For a breathless moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The crowd, the music, the opulent surroundings. There was only Antonio, his dark eyes holding mine with an intensity that made my pulse race. Then he excused himself from his group and moved toward me with that predatory grace I'd noticed the first time we met. "Emma," he said softly when he reached me, his gaze traveling appreciatively over the transformation. "You look stunning." Despite everything, I felt a flush of pleasure at the approval in his eyes. "What am I doing here, Antonio? What is this?" His mouth curved in a smile. "This is your glimpse into the world I offered you." He held out his hand. "Shall we?" I hesitated, acutely aware of the curious glances being cast our way. Antonio Ricci wasn't a man who went unnoticed, and his focused attention on me, a nobody from a rundown neighborhood, was clearly causing ripples of interest through the glittering crowd. "Everyone's staring," I whispered, my hand trembling slightly as I placed it in his. "Let them," he replied simply, leading me deeper into the ballroom. His hand was warm around mine, his grip secure but gentle. "Most of these people would sell their souls for a few moments of my attention. You have it for the entire evening. Lucky me," I murmured, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Antonio's lips quirked in amusement as he guided me toward the bar. "Champagne?" I nodded, grateful for something to do with my hands, as Antonio signaled to the bartender. A tall man in an expensive suit approached, clapping Antonio on the shoulder with forced familiarity. "Ricci, didn't expect to see you tonight. Thought you'd be tied up with the Shanghai deal." The man's gaze slid to me, his smile turning appreciative. And who might this lovely creature be? Something dangerous flashed in Antonio's eyes, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. "Emma Walsh," he introduced me, his hand moving to the small of my back in a gesture that felt oddly possessive. "Emma, this is Congressman James Wheeler." I nearly choked on my champagne. A congressman? What kind of charity event was this? "Charmed," Wheeler said, taking my free hand and pressing his lips to it a moment too long. How did an old devil like Ricci manage to capture someone so refreshing? Before I could respond, Antonio smoothly interjected. "Emma saved my son's life recently. I'm eternally in her debt." Wheeler's eyebrows shot up. "Is that so? Well, earning Antonio Ricci's gratitude is no small feat. The man never forgets a favor or a slight." He chuckled, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his voice. "If you'll excuse us," Antonio said, his tone courteous but dismissive. "I promised Emma a tour of the art collection." Wheeler nodded, his eyes darting between us with undisguised curiosity. Of course. Perhaps we'll talk later about that zoning issue." "My assistant will call yours," Antonio replied, already steering me away. "Congressman?" I hissed once we were out of earshot. "What kind of business are you really in?" Antonio's hand remained at the small of my back, a warm, steady pressure guiding me through the crowd. The legitimate kind, primarily. Real estate, imports, private security. Politicians are useful for zoning laws, tax incentives, bureaucratic necessities. And the illegitimate kind? I dared to ask. His dark eyes met mine, unreadable. "Is that really what you want to discuss tonight, Emma? The details of businesses that don't concern you? Don't they? You're asking me to come work for you, live in your home. I think I have a right to know what I'd be getting involved with." We had reached a quieter corner of the ballroom, partially secluded behind a massive floral arrangement. Antonio turned to face me fully, his expression serious. "You would be working for my mother, living in her private wing. My businesses would not touch you." He paused, then added quietly, "Unless you wanted them to." The implication in his words, the intensity of his gaze, made my breath catch. "I don't understand why you're doing all this. The job offer, buying rosies, this..." I gestured to my borrowed finery. "What do you want from me, Antonio?" For a long moment, he simply studied me, as if weighing how much truth to share. "When Matteo was born," he finally said, "his mother died in childbirth. A rare complication, nothing the doctors could have prevented. Since then, he's been surrounded by nannies, security, tutors, people paid to care for him. Until you." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean? You found a lost, frightened child in the rain, and your only thought was to protect him. Not because it was your job, not because of who his father is, but simply because it was the right thing to do." Antonio's voice had softened, a vulnerability creeping in that I hadn't heard before. "Do you know how rare that is in my world, Emma? Genuine kindness without agenda?" I swallowed hard, moved despite myself by the raw honesty in his expression. "So this is all because I helped Matteo?" "It began that way," he acknowledged. "A debt to be repaid, but then I met you. Stubborn, principled, refusing my money." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You intrigued me. So I'm what? A curiosity? A novelty in your world of yes-men and politicians?" I tried to keep my voice steady, ignoring the flutter in my stomach at his words. You're a breath of fresh air, he corrected, stepping closer. Someone who sees me as a man, not a means to an end, or a threat to be feared. I'm pretty sure I've been afraid of you since the moment we met, I admitted. Antonio's expression softened further. And yet here you stand, challenging me, questioning me, not cowering. His hand rose, hesitating a fraction before his fingers brushed lightly against my cheek. That's courage, Emma. Another rarity in my experience. The gentle touch sent electricity skittering across my skin. I should step back, create distance from this dangerous, compelling man. Instead, I found myself leaning slightly into his hand. You still haven't answered my question, I whispered. What do you want from me? His dark eyes held mine, searching. Everything you're willing to give. Before I could process the implications of that statement, the string quartet shifted to a new piece, a haunting melody that seemed to wrap around us. Dance with me, Antonio said, the words somewhere between a request and a command. He led me to the dance floor, one hand settling at my waist, the other taking mine in a proper waltz position. I'd never formally danced in my life, but Antonio moved with such confidence that I found myself following effortlessly, as if my body instinctively understood what he asked of it. You make this look easy, I murmured as he guided me through a turn. Years of practice, he replied. My mother insisted I learn, said it would teach me discipline and grace. The mention of his mother reminded me of the ostensible reason for our connection. How is she doing? Your mother? Improving. Stubborn, like her son. His hand tightened fractionally on my waist. She asks about you daily. What have you told her? That you're considering our offer. He studied my face. Are you? I took a deep breath. I don't belong in this world, Antonio. Designer dresses, charity galas, congressmen kissing my hand. This isn't me. It could be, he said simply, if you wanted it. And if I don't, if all I want is my old life back? Antonio's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Then I would be disappointed, but I would accept your decision. Rosie's would still undergo renovations. Ms. Rosario would still receive her generous contract, and you would return to your apartment and your life. Just like that? No consequences? I searched his face for signs of deception. No consequences, he confirmed. But no further opportunities either. My world doesn't offer second chances, Emma. The music drew to a close, but Antonio didn't release me. Instead, he guided me toward a set of glass doors that led to a balcony overlooking the city. Outside, the night air was crisp, the lights of Manhattan creating a glittering panorama below us. Beautiful, isn't it? Antonio said, coming to stand beside me at the stone balustrade. Yes, I admitted, drawing the borrowed shawl tighter around my shoulders against the chill. Antonio shrugged out of his tuxedo jacket and draped it over my shoulders before I could protest. The fabric was warm from his body, enveloping me in his scent. My family came to this country with nothing, he said, gazing out at the skyline. My grandfather worked on the docks, saved every penny, eventually bought a small import business. My father expanded it, added real estate, security. He paused. And other ventures. I remained silent, sensing he rarely shared these details. By the time I was born, the Ricci name meant something in certain circles. Respect, fear, opportunity. His profile was sharp against the city lights. I was raised to protect that name, to expand our holdings, to ensure our family's legacy. And Mateo? I asked softly. Is that his future too? Antonio turned to me, his expression somber. That's his birthright, unless he chooses another path. Would you let him choose another path? I would let him be happy, Antonio said, the words seeming to surprise even him. Whatever that means for him. I studied him in the moonlight, this contradiction of a man, ruthless businessman, feared power broker, devoted father. And what about you, Antonio? What makes you happy? Something shifted in his gaze, heated and intent. Currently, standing on a balcony with a beautiful woman who isn't afraid to ask me difficult questions, my cheeks warmed under his scrutiny. Flattery won't make me say yes to your offer. Not flattery, he corrected. Truth. A commodity as rare in my world as genuine kindness. He stepped closer, the space between us charged with unspoken possibilities. I won't lie to you, Emma. The world I inhabit is complex, often dangerous. My family has enemies. My businesses require difficult decisions. Illegal decisions? I pressed, needing clarity. Antonio's mouth curved in a rueful smile. Let's say there are gray areas in any successful enterprise. But my son's future, my mother's legacy, those I protect at all costs, within the bounds of the law, or outside them if necessary. His honesty was disarming. No pretense, no denial. Just the simple truth of who he was. And where would I fit in this world of yours? I asked, my voice barely audible above the distant city sounds. As your mother's nurse? Mateo's friend? Another employee in your empire? Antonio's hand rose to my face, his thumb tracing the curve of my cheek with exquisite gentleness. You would be under my protection, part of my family's inner circle. What that becomes beyond that, his gaze dropped briefly to my lips, would depend on us both. My heart thundered in my chest. Antonio, you asked what I want from you, he murmured, leaning closer. The truth is, I'm not entirely sure myself. I only know that since you entered our lives, something has changed. Mateo smiles more. My mother has found new determination in her recovery, and He hesitated, an unusual uncertainty crossing his features. I find myself thinking of you when I should be focused on business. His admission, so human in its vulnerability, cracked something inside me. This powerful, dangerous man was standing before me, confessing that I had affected him, disrupted his carefully ordered world. I'm just a waitress from a bad neighborhood, I whispered. I have nothing to offer someone like you. You have everything to offer, he countered. Honesty, compassion, courage, the qualities my world too often lacks. His hand slipped to the nape of my neck, sending shivers down my spine. Say yes, Emma. Come into my world, not just for my mother or Mateo, but for yourself, for what might be possible between us. In that moment, poised on the edge of a decision that would irrevocably change my life, I thought of my cramped apartment, my dead-end job, the lonely existence I'd carved out for myself. Then, I thought of Mateo's trusting eyes, Antonio's mother waiting for a nurse who would treat her gently, and this complex, impossible man before me, offering me not just luxury but belonging. Yes, I breathed, the word escaping before I could reconsider. Yes, I'll come. Relief and something darker, more possessive, flashed in Antonio's eyes. He closed the final distance between us, his lips finding mine in a kiss that started gentle, but quickly blazed into something hungrier, more demanding. I responded with equal fervor, my hands sliding up his chest to curl around his shoulders. When we finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Antonio rested his forehead against mine. You won't regret this decision, Emma. I'll make sure of it. Looking into his eyes, I believed him. Whatever darkness shadowed his world, whatever dangers lurked at its edges, I would face them with the same courage that had led me to help a lost boy in the rain. And perhaps, in this new life, I would find not just security and purpose, but something I'd never dared hope for, love, in all its complicated, frightening, exhilarating glory. Antonio's arm circled my waist, drawing me against his side as we turned to face the glittering city. His city, now partly mine. The future stretched before us, uncertain but full of possibility. Come, he said softly. Let's go home. Mateo will be waiting. Home. The word had never held much meaning for me before. But as Antonio led me back inside, his hand warm and secure in mine, I realized that perhaps I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all along. Not in a place, but in the unlikely family that had claimed me as their own.